speaker in this session is Jay Elsinger, who's teaching at Lewis University, based out of Romeoville, Illinois. He's going to be talking about implementing specification grading into college level courses. So, Jay?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And yeah, thanks, Sarah and Daniel, for joining me today. Yeah, feel free to ask questions if you have. Happy to post here. I guess I'll share my screen. Yes. Okay, good. You see the slides?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so in this talk, I'll describe perhaps in a different way that one might go about grading long-term assignments or projects. And in this, I have in mind something where students would participate in early in the course, and the final product of which would happen later in the course. And in between, there would be revisions and checkpoints based on new content that's covered in the course. What I'm going to do here is describe a way to, rather than try to assign a number between 0 to 100, to sort of somehow describe the quality of work, but also the number of requirements met. I'm going to describe something different, a way of grading, which is called specifications grading. So what I'll do here is I'll briefly describe what specifications grading is about, some of the literature around it, how I incorporate it in my classes, and then try to quickly get into incorporating the idea with projects. So instead of trying to start by perhaps describing flaws in traditional grading, instead I'll just ask if you could use any grading system you want, what would the most ideal grading system have? What are some of the attributes it has? And here's some that I agree that such a system would have, and perhaps you can think of others. I want a grading system to uphold high standards. There's a lot of pressure on faculty based on student evaluations to perhaps not have their classes be as rigorous, because it would require students to do more work and perhaps not be as happy about it. I want grades to reflect what's actually learned in the course. And in particular, can you tell me exactly which learning outcomes the students are doing well in and which they aren't? I want grades to motivate students to learn, not just because of points extrinsically, but ideally from something intrinsically, for just a wanting to become better. Unfortunately, having points the way it is traditionally turns education into a bit of a game for students, or at least the way a lot of students view it that way. I also want grades to motivate students to become better than where they are at currently, and for a grading system to have built-in incentives to guide and help students in doing that. And in addition, I don't want grades to be so stressful. There's a lot of stress around grades, especially it's been increasing over the years. And I want students to feel like they're earning their grades versus me giving them their grades. So specifications grading is a research-based methodology. I have a few sources here. You can take a screenshot if you'd like. There's a new book out just recently, Grading for Growth, that goes over, and specifications grading by Linda Nilson was probably the first work that popularized this idea. And both of these books have a lot of examples from different disciplines and institutions and student audiences. And behind all of this is the idea incorporated of a growth mindset, which is the idea that intellect can be developed. And there's these two other works that I really like that goes into a holistic idea of this, because I use a lot of student-centered approaches in my classes, how learning works, and learner-centered teaching. I think that all kind of goes together. I've also published a little bit on this myself. In 2020, I was working with Drew Lewis at South Alabama, incorporating at the time standards-based grading into math courses, and we have a paper published in Primus about that. And since then, I've adjusted the system, and I would now call it specifications grading, and I'm now currently writing a paper, hoping to get that submitted pretty soon. So the way I incorporate grading, the specifications grading, is I have 5 things that specify how it works. And it's really the third one. I'll put them up here. It's really the third one that I'm going to focus on in terms of homework assignments or these like long-term projects. So in a sense, I have the course broken up into individual learning outcomes, and every problem is associated with one of those learning outcomes. I grade them on a scale from 0 to 3 and allow students to successfully complete them more than once to try and demonstrate some retention. And I only keep the best mark. This is one of the key attributes here. So if a student tries a problem the first time and gets it wrong, maybe with a score of 1 out of 3, studies it a little bit more, and then the next time I offer that learning outcome, a different problem, maybe they feel more confident, they come back, they do it correctly, I would give them a 3 out of 3 and replace the previous one with a 3, or just keep their highest score. Yeah, and then the grades throughout the course are determined by how many of these learning outcomes they're able to master by the end of the course. But it's this third one here, providing opportunities to reassess previous things that need revision. So this is the idea we're going to move here with projects. Just a brief mention here, I've done this concept, specifications grading or standards-based grading with a lot of courses. Previously, I was at Florida Southern College, and now I'm at Lewis University. But quite a lot of courses that I've done this with. And the project I'll use as an example is one that I use in elementary statistics. So I'll talk about that course briefly, just to give you a flavor for how this is possibly done here, and then we'll talk about the project. So for elementary statistics in general, for a course, I'll try and break it down into what are the big questions, the main units of the course. And then for each unit, I'll break that down into individual learning outcomes still. So here, for example, are the chapter 1 questions from elementary statistics, talking about sampling techniques and possible problems that can go with that. So students would have a problem for 1.1, 1.2, and so on. And by the end of the course, they would be collecting points, 3s for every time they get a correct problem. And what I do is I specify how many of those points are needed to get an A, B, or C. And here I just have a partial rubric of that. And I often have to remind students that the specification there for an A does not mean everything in the course needs to be mastered completely. As you see on the bottom, there is a little wiggle room for students to choose a little bit, and especially sometimes I don't cover all the topics that I have on the list. In addition, another key fact here is that homework and tests do not average. They have to do them separately. I separately specify how many homework requirements they must do and how many points they must get from their quizzes and exams. It's all together, lumped together in one bucket of points in order to reach their letter grade. And there's a communication with the student throughout the course to make sure they're on track, and both levels are at the same for whichever letter grade they're going for. I'll mention a couple really great things that I've noticed pretty much using this right away from when I made the switch, because of those ideal things from a grading system I mentioned earlier. In my experience, I noticed that traditional grading didn't really accomplish any of those things at all. So when I switched to something else, I noticed something really great. Students started to actually take more control of their learning. They learned from mistakes by doing the problems over and over, simple mistakes. Writing improved. This is really big, especially in statistics. A lot of students need to learn to write more and be more descriptive. So this is a way for them to try and try again. And this is just a quick graph. Sometimes I ask my students at the end of the course, hey, would you prefer these mastery-based exams, or would you rather the traditional-based exams? And it's usually pretty overwhelmingly preferred for the mastery-based exams. Okay, so the project. The project is from elementary statistics, and it's the Oreo project. The research question is, do double stuffed Oreos actually have twice the filling of traditional Oreos? That's the question. And what I do is after the first chapter, after we talk about sampling techniques and collecting data, then I introduce this project. That'll be a long-term thing in the course. And we actually do the data collection in class. We're talking about the sample collections. We can talk about the design of the study, all that sort of beginning stuff. And I buy some cookies of each kind. I bring them to class. I have little trays, some knives, and I bought some portable scales from Amazon. So I have my students in groups of 4. They have like a scale for each group. And they do their best to scrape the filling onto a tray. Be careful to tear the scale. They weigh each scale. And I created a Google Sheet that I invite everyone to beforehand. So students on their phone or on their laptop can input the data, and everyone can see the data set come together in real time. And also show what I did was I also created a Word doc, or I have it here in a Google Doc, where I have a placeholder for all of these sections that will be in the final report. And what I did is I just wrote comments on the side to help students know, hey, this is the kind of stuff you should write about in this section. Here are some things maybe you should consider in your response. And you can further break this down, which I might do next time, to say the different letter grades, which I'll showcase here in a moment. I kind of have this bare skeleton that I would give them after we collect that data. I also like to show them too this making data meaningful. It's a nice description of trying to write about data in an interesting way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe how I might break this down in terms of A, B, and C without assigning like scores per se. And what I'll do is I'll start by describing some attributes that I might like an A paper to have. And then I'll start to take away things to say what a B might be and what a C might be. And then I have some examples for most of these individual grades that I can show you too. So first I'll describe how I might think about the paper overall, and then I'll describe letter grades for each individual section. I don't think I'll have time to talk about them all, but once I talk about one or two, it should be clear. So here, for example, a criteria for when I think about the paper at the end, so first I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about the individual sections. So overall, at the final submission, what are some things I think that an A could be? Well, there's some things I could think of to spruce it up. You get like a title page, get some page numbering, have a nice title, but make sure it's accurate. You can give an abstract. That's a very nice thing. You can have some references. I do give one reference when I do the project, so they can use that reference or welcome to find some more. Try to reference those in the paper. Of course, appropriate sections in every length. And of course, you might think of other things. So here's an example. So here's someone's title page, for example, has that running header. You can see the pages are numbered, has a title. I might suggest to the students to maybe say our double stuff Oreos, really double the stuff, just to make it clear we're talking about Oreos. But yeah, I like it. Here's an example, same student of an abstract that was written. And you see, look at it briefly, it looks pretty good. I did notice a little typo here at the end. The student does have the conclusion, but I think they meant less than 0.001. But otherwise, yeah, I don't have much to say here. Very nicely written statement here. So for a B, what kind of things might I take away? Well, for a B, maybe you don't have to worry about the sprucing up of the page, the abstract of the title page, and maybe just reference that one reference I give and don't worry about finding any others. And then for a C, I'll take away some things still, where really I'm just looking for a title. Give me a decent grammar. It doesn't have to be great, but give me decent grammar. And you have some figures, but make sure that they're kind of labeled. And that's kind of the bare minimum. And anything less than that is just not passing. Okay, I was just thinking about some attributes overall. So I'll break down here into the individual sections, which correspond to the assignments throughout the semester. So there's 4 of them. I've broken this into 4 sections based on, after covering a certain collection of chapters. So for the first part, the introduction. So here's maybe some things I might like to see in an A paper, for example. Maybe describe Oreos a little bit, describe the company, when these things were created. You can refer to some previous studies. There are some other folks out there who have done this in class as well. I mean, this not much, but it's kind of stuff, some things out there. Make sure you describe the question that we're asking, the purpose of the study. And yeah, I like to have it be at least a page, so double spaced. And here's an example of that same student from before. And you can see there towards the bottom have some citations describing results from something else. Very well written. So what I'll do here is I won't really need to show you A work. We can all kind of envision what that looks like. But I'd like to show you kind of sub-A work and then describe some of the feedback that I would give. So the first assignment would be after we do the experiment and describe sampling techniques. While it's fresh in their mind, write about it. The way we collected samples, note any potential issues, problems that have occurred, that kind of thing. And that's sort of their first assignment in terms of their project. And maybe for a B, maybe they don't need to do this extra work of looking up something about the Oreos or trying to find anything about previous studies. Just describe what happened in a clear way. And here's an example that does that. This is the entire introduction. And it's pretty good in terms of describing what happens, what the question is, and what we did, but doesn't bother to do the extra stuff. For a C, okay, so maybe I might the length is often much less, and really just describe the question, but with maybe not as much words. And here's an example of this. And first of all, it doesn't quite fit the format. I had asked for double spaced, but the student here does address those things. They're sort of addressing those bullets in that comment, but in a very minimal way. So I might introduce the student to try and talk a little bit more about excuse me, certain aspects, or maybe ask a few questions to get the students to write a little bit more. So students would turn this in and I would sort of give this feedback. And I could also show them these things as like a rubric. I could put this together. Students can have at the beginning and they can see and decide what level of work that they want to do. Again, giving them that autonomy. And then they would have a chance to revise it and turn it in at another time, in which case you give them more feedback. And I think I have here, yes, an example of maybe something that is not passing yet. Title is Oreo Project, which I think could be a little better. And the intro there is just that one little sentence. So obviously not enough. So I'm sort of relaying feedback to the student. I'm not necessarily saying, hey, this is an 83 and this is a 72, but I'm kind of giving the students feedback on how they're doing in terms of meeting the standards that I've set for these different letter grades. It's a little bit of a communication, a little bit of self-awareness on their part to know, hey, what letter grade do I want to go for? How much work do I want to do? And a lot of times it comes up with a conversation. I think I have a time here to talk about a little bit more. Yeah, the second part. After the next chapter or so, we talk about organizing data once it's collected, making plots. Typically, I talk about box and whisker plots, histograms, a little bit of QQ plots, thinking about trying to assess the assumption of normality being used later in the t-test. So the students don't know that yet, but I have them write about the QQ plots if they want, for example, the A. So talk about those plots a little bit, describe them with what we're learning, shapes, centers, that kind of thing. Make sure everything's labeled fine. You can describe qualitatively the normality. And then later on in the semester, once we talk about hypothesis testing, they can come back to this section and add that in later. So for a B, maybe they don't do the whole part with normality. They do everything else, but they maybe state that there's an assumption of normality, but then don't assess it. And here's an example of what might be a B. So this section starts off with just a graph. So I would suggest to the student to try and write something in the beginning so that doesn't just start with a picture. And they have the summary statistics. It's clearly there in the table, and then a nice paragraph, which does describe things fairly nicely. I would just suggest the student to try and write something in the beginning mainly, and maybe perhaps make the plots look a little better. Perhaps there were some histograms that were missing. I can ask the student to try and explore those other plots as well, and then check your conclusions here to see if they're the same. Yeah, and then for a C, I'll drop things off even still. So just, give me a couple plots and then just describe them a little bit. And here's an example of this. Another section starting off with plots and then just a little blip here. So the student did have some parts in it, like a appendix where they were showing some of that calculations or the descriptive statistics, but there's no describing it. It just says, see this for the calculations or see the data, but there's no descriptions of it. Because in particular, we want to look at the means of these two and somehow compare them at least so you can describe those. And I think I also have an example of not yet passing. I guess, which is a very short and brief section. Is clearly missing many of the standards there that I had listed. And what I'll say here is the next part talking about the methodology is once we a little more later in the course, now they'll have time to revise this part of it, these parts of the project, and then once we talk about hypothesis testing a little more, now they can go in and fill in those parts of it, so they can describe what test will be used as we're learning about it, and then the last part is the discussion and recommendations, which is when they talk about the possible errors, the bias, lurking variables, what could we have done differently, that sort of thing. And it's very similar. I have examples of that too, which I suppose you can see when I have the slides, but I think we're getting about the ends. I just want to check if there are any questions. Happy to answer some questions.
Yeah, how you do this before you do normal distribution and so forth, right? So you're very early in the course, right?
Right.
And they kind of like fooling around with stuff. I mean, and collecting their own data. Is that?
Yeah, I hope that was my goal, was to try and, because it's just not as fun, or it's like when it's made up in class or when I give it to them. So I'd hope this would make an experience where they're like part of it. Yeah, I've thought about doing it a few times in the course, not just once in the beginning, but yeah, I kind of have that data collection at the beginning. And then once we cover like histograms and box plot, well, how does that apply to the Oreo data? That could be like I used to do that as a homework, and now I've incorporated it into this project. Take that data and do what we've done in class with it. And I hope that makes it a little more interesting.
Yeah, so you can revisit data they collected. That's the nice,
Exactly.
right? So
Yeah.
Sarah has how do you connect the letter grades on the projects to the point system you mentioned at the beginning? I'm not so sure what.
Oh, yeah, good question. Yes, good question. Yeah, I'll say that um, when I was coming up with this talk, I was trying to create how I might take this project and make it like um, without sort of points and grading it. But yeah, ultimately, I do have things in terms of homework points. So yeah, that's a good question. I think initially it can set like a C to be so many homework points and a B to be so many homework points. Because that's essentially what I have. Like each turn in homework is 5 homework points, and basically get that once you complete the whole assignment. You keep revising it until you get there. So there's a limit for how much they need, say for a B in homework points, and you can kind of play with how many points they need. But actually, that's a really good question. I'm going to have to think about that a little bit more. Yeah, because previously I had things in terms of points.
And I have a question. Where did you get the idea about this experiment about does the double stuff have?
Yeah, I know. Such an interesting idea. There's quite a few years ago, there was a short article published in a magazine. I think it was called Teaching Mathematics or something. And it was a really short blip about the idea. That's how I got the idea. And it just explains it. And then since then, I've kind of ran with it and tried to include a project with it and make it integral in the course.
So someone had done with Oreos the double stuff game, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and actually, the one student I showed previously with the A actually found someone in Clemson made a poster presentation, and someone else was doing it in class too. So yeah, there's some folks out there doing it, but I'm not sure if anyone has like this project semester long idea with it. So I think that might be
So again, what was their conclusion?
not double the stuff.
So I could have them because it's good for my diet because they're not stuffed. Is that right?
I
Huh?
like that. Yes, I
Yeah.
like that. I think there is some thing too where the company used to have double the stuff or some kind of comment about that, but then now it's removed.
Okay. Um, we have a little bit more time. Other questions? I see. Do they test for difference, but not always double? Oh, I guess Daniel is saying, do they test for difference, but not always double? In other words, the differences between cookies or something.
That's a really good question. I think I've just focused on the question of comparing twice the mean of the traditional to the mean of the double stuffed Oreos.
Okay. Is
Yeah,
there
so
much of a distribution? You take a double stuff and you weigh those. Is there much of a distribution in the weight of double stuffs
yeah,
even?
that's a great question.
I think you had some plots that
Yes, let me go back to that. Yes,
maybe it's because it's getting close to dinner that I'm getting hungry that I want to talk about food. I don't know.
yeah, I can show you real quick. Yeah, here's an example. I did this recently. Yeah, and you do see some variation. You gotta be careful that the students do it right. Some students don't understand the tearing a little bit, so you gotta be careful there. But yes, you do see some variation. Also too, there's problems with scraping the cookie, and this is stuff they have to put about in their recommendations and their
Okay.
discussion. Yeah.
Did you scrape it real clean or did you press the cream into the cookie? Right? Yeah, that's
Yeah, someone was talking about how, some of the crumbles are in there and couldn't get it all off. And yeah, absolutely. I've
okay.
noticed metal is better than plastic, that kind of stuff.
Have you come up with other interesting projects like that on everyday stuff? I mean,
The only one I've heard of is which I haven't tried though, is just like comparing the distribution of chocolate chip cookies in homemade cookies versus store-bought cookies.
oh,
Um,
the chips really, right?
right, yeah, the chips distribution in there somehow. Yeah, that was an interesting one I've heard of. But I really would like to have more of these. The issue is it takes a lot to develop one and to get the good idea for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I hope that, at least with differential equations, I imagine a model and students might be studying it throughout the course as things are being learned, new techniques that you can go back and apply to something that was thought
Or,
out.
you introduce a non-homogeneous term that you couldn't do in the first few weeks. So you got to revisit it and it gets more realistic or whatever. So let's see.
I'll say I saw the comment. I'll say also, feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah.
I'll
So
put my email here.
Daniel, who's sort of restricted in terms of his connectivity, has been able to hear and watch, and he is giving you serious praise and thanking you. So,
I appreciate it. Thank you.
have you done these? Are always in class, or can you do these online, or what?
Hmm. The right, because when COVID happened, I stopped doing it. Yeah, because the in-class collection part obviously had to stop.
Okay.
Um, I actually I'm thinking about it. I mean, the students could at home, I suppose they'd have to get their own cookies, but hey, get
Yeah.
four of each. Oh, I don't know how they would weigh them though. But yeah, they could input the data
That's true
somehow.
too. They've got to
Yeah,
have a precise scale.
yeah. Yeah, so sometimes I've been able to borrow some from the chemistry lab, or like I said, I have
Yep.
these little ones that
But
that's the other thing too. They just sometimes they're one decimal place little scales. That's another thing. Yeah.
well, I
Uh,
have
yeah.
found that when you go to disciplinary departments, they'll give you equipment because they got to get rid of it. So,
Mm.
well, listen, we've got to move on to the next sessions. I want to thank Jay very much and wish him well. Uh,
Yeah, thank you.
and those of you who I can't see, I know are furiously applauding and jumping up and down in enthusiastic responses. So take care and thank you again, Jay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Ciao.